What's up, guys? It's Friday, and so you know what time it is. It's time for What the Fitness. But first, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment for the algorithm. Also, you might have noticed we have new shirts. That's right, Human Randomized Controlled Trials, now available as a shirt. You can click the link in the description, go to the Biolayne store, pick you up one of these. There was a video that came out with Paul Saladino being interviewed by Derek of More Plates, More Dates, and apparently Paul is saying he's no longer carnivore, which I've actually known for a while now because he was talking about eating fruit and honey. But let's just see what Paul had to say about no longer being carnivore.
You don't even really call yourself a carnivore anymore. Like, you changed your Instagram name and everything. Do you want to speak to that briefly?
Yeah. So the backstory here is that I guess in 2018, I cut out all the plants from my diet and basically ate meat, organs, and fat for close to 2 years. Mm-hmm. During that time, I wrote the Carnivore Code, got interested in this carnivore diet, got interested in the potential for some plant foods to trigger autoimmunity in some people, which is kind of that's my framework, because I had pretty bad eczema for a long time in my life, and I had bad eczematous reactions throughout medical school, college, even residency, that spurred me to think about this idea, like, are all plants good for all people? Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of these ideas around the carnivore diet. Now, the end of that story, or the next chapter of the story, was about 2 years into the carnivore diet. I started noticing persistence of unpleasant symptoms. So testosterone drops.
Wait, this would have been while he was writing the book.
Sleep disturbances, palpitations, muscle cramps.
So he noticed this while writing the book.
And I started to think, okay, maybe long-term ketosis is not great for me. And I was definitely in ketosis at the time, monitoring blood ketones with a meter, not deep ketosis, but definitely ketosis. And so at that point, I started to dig into the research a little bit more and understood that insulin signaling is critical at the level of the kidney to hold on to minerals, to hold on to potassium, calcium, sodium, chloride, magnesium, and that in long-term ketosis in most humans, you're going to become so electrolyte depleted that it's almost impossible to resolve that with enormous amounts of electrolytes, right? You can take all of the electrolytes you want. You can do so much salt. Your body's really not going to be able to hold on to those without some sort of an insulin signal at the level of the kidney. I've experienced this. Tons of people experience this with long-term ketosis.
But there's a lot of people who do long-term ketosis who don't have that.
Make this
felt better because he ate carbs.
Learning judgment that long-term ketosis was not a great thing for me and probably not a great thing for most humans. And at that point, I added honey and then...
See, my issue with this is, it's like, well, I didn't feel better because of the carbs. It was actually because of the electrolytes that I'm hanging on to. No, you have some muscle glycogen now. You feel better. Maybe electrolytes play into that a little bit, but there's plenty of people who do ketosis for long periods of time who don't have those issues. But anyway.
My diet, and it's been an evolution since then for probably the last 3 years. So now I've been eating fruit, honey as my main sources of carbohydrates, maple syrup, raw milk, the lactose in raw milk.
What didn't Paul say was one of these people that was like, sugar is bad for you?
If you look at animal studies, which are never a perfect representation of a human trial, but they give us some clue, rats do much worse on high fructose corn syrup than they do with plain sucrose. They gain more weight on calorie-matched high fructose corn syrup than they do with sucrose. So what's going on there? Is it hidden calories? Is it undigested starch that's not being accounted for? Who knows?
Because it all breaks down into basically the same stuff in the body, but I digress.
For going on 3 years now and feeling much better. Testosterone is 800, free testosterone is great. Sex hormone binding globulin goes down. We'll talk about this. Free T3 goes back up. Thyroid hormones improve. Cholesterol, lipids go down. Still, my LDL-C or my LDL-P is above what many people would consider to be optimal. And we can talk about why I don't think that's an issue. But certainly there are changes that happen in humans without carbohydrates in their diet at the level of hormones, at the level of electrolytes, at the level of lipids. And these are interesting to me. So I'm actually, when people sometimes meet me or they talk to me now, they say, hey, I want to go on a carnivore diet. And I say, you mean an animal-based diet, right? And that's just a term that, I think the term came the first time I was on a podcast with Joe Rogan. He kind of coined that term and we ran with it. I think of animal-based as just a framework, like, okay, most of your diet is animal foods, at least in terms of calories. And I think most of my diet is now, it's organs, it's grass-fed meat, it's butter, it's tallow, it's raw milk. And then I get a significant amount of calories from carbohydrates in the form of fruit juice, honey, et cetera. So yeah, so that's an animal-based diet. And I think that works a lot better for most people. Now, to be fair, and what's interesting about this is a lot of people would look at that diet and say it's still very restrictive, quote unquote. And we can talk about that because what am I excluding in an animal-based diet? I'm not eating grains. So white rice is kind of a gray area, but I don't eat white rice. I don't eat oats. I don't eat wheat. I don't eat beans. I don't eat seeds. I don't eat nuts. I don't eat leaves. And a lot of those foods are considered to be healthy by the mainstream. And so that is a similarity from carnivore that I've carried over, but I have started including carbohydrates in the form of the fruit and the honey. And the reason I do those, the intentionality there is if you look at a plant and a plant's life cycle, the intention of the plant is to move its seeds to the next generation in a colorful, sweet fruit. And if you look at plant foods and you look at overarching terms like defense chemicals, the lowest amounts of defense chemicals are in the fruit. That's pretty clear. And the lowest amounts of those defense chemicals actually occur as the fruit ripens. So you can see all sorts of defense chemicals. We can talk about interesting examples if you want, or we can go deeper in the lipids. But things like non-protein amino acids, these are lower, and other plant defense chemicals, they're lower as the fruit ripens. So there's these signals within the plant kingdom that say, hey, this food is less toxic once I'm ready for that seed to go germinate.
Okay. He's never had a toxicology class. I don't know. I mean, we've covered this multiple times, but the whole defense chemicals thing, he'll point out chemicals in plants. A great example is his video on broccoli and isocyanates, and that's why broccoli is bullshit, because it binds to iodine, and that's gonna screw up your thyroid and slow down your metabolism. You're gonna gain weight. Except, what do we see when we look at the human randomized control trials? Broccoli doesn't negatively affect the thyroid, it doesn't lower your BMR, and people who eat more cruciferous vegetables, if anything, lose more weight than people who don't. Every single food that you eat has some chemical in it, because remember, kiddies, everything's a chemical that if fed in a high dose would have toxic effects on you. A great example in meat, NUE5GC exists in meat. The human thyroid produces antibodies against it. That's actually better evidence that it negatively affects the thyroid than what Paul made for plants. But why doesn't he talk about that chemical? See, this is what we call an asymmetric application of logic. And this is a big problem. And it's also how you know if someone is heavily biased. Because if you are going to make a logical argument, you have to apply it symmetrically. So if I am going to say, well, there's defense chemicals in plants, well, then I also have to think, are there chemicals in meat that could do similar? And the answer is yes, okay? The answer is yes. Either we have to worry about all chemicals in all foods, regardless of the dose, like Paul says, or perhaps this is a dosage issue, and that's what matters. Another thing that's upset me about Paul is his comments about epidemiology. Now, I think epidemiology is very limited in what it can do, and I do think there are some really good long-term cohort studies that can tell us some things, but it is very limited, especially when compared to human randomized control trials. But Paul has said, and you can find a YouTube video where the title is Epidemiology is Garbage. And this is presumably because he's referring to the epidemiology correlating meat with cancer incidence. That's great, but then when there's epidemiology that Paul likes, he cites it liberally. And he did this on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I pointed it out. And so, again, this is an asymmetric application of logic. If all epidemiology is garbage, he didn't say most, then why are you citing it? Well, it's because it fits with his bias. I do want to commend him because I think, especially as somebody who has made their handle Carnivore MD and now changed it, that's a very difficult position to walk back, obviously. And so I commend him for changing his mind and deciding to do something different. However, I think his explanation is kind of weird. It's kind of convenient that it's been walked back after he's written a book about it, saying how this is the optimal human diet. So the Carnivore Code was published in February of 2020. Paul started talking about the carnivore diet all the way back in 2018. That means this book was published, he said 2 years in. This would have been right around the time he started experiencing these symptoms, these negative symptoms he talked about. If you're experiencing these symptoms, why would you take a book to publish knowing that and not talking about it? So it does feel a little bit disingenuous. Maybe he has an explanation for it, but that feels very disingenuous to me. So people have asked me, well, Lane, what's the difference between you've changed your mind on stuff versus him changing his mind on stuff? I think the big difference is the verbiage I use. It would be reflected in an updated book. It would be reflected in my content. And also, like, for example, I changed my mind on branched chain amino acids circa 2018. I had closed a supplement company that I'd had a few years back, and I think that ended in 2017. And as I dug more and more into the literature on BCAAs, I just kind of became relatively convinced that supplemental BCAAs, just for most people, weren't really worth it. So when my new company started, Outwork, we launched in 2020, we didn't have a BCA product. And a lot of people asked me for it. A lot of people wanted me to have one. And I said no because I couldn't justify it by the evidence. So I think the difference is also just how strongly you word something. If I am not totally sure of something, usually when I'm talking about the data, I'll make the devil's advocate argument, but then I'll explain why I think my position that I'm taking is the correct one. But he doesn't do that, at least not that I've seen. He just wrote this book that, talking about the optimal human diet. Hey, it's a free country. He can do whatever he wants. But I just think it's a really poor look to now say, yeah, I was having all these symptoms and I published this book even though I was having these symptoms. It feels kind of convenient to me that he made a bunch of money off his supplement line, a bunch of money off this book. And now it's like, oh, by the way, everybody, a lot of people feel like crap when they're on this. And then I also find it funny that it's like I have to cover this in every video. My nails are painted because my daughter paints them before every big meet. I'm filming this after Nationals. So got a problem with it. Come live more than me at Nationals. You won't, so quiet. Very conflicted about this. I do give him credit. He could have continued to just say the same things even though he was doing something different. So I want to be clear. I give him credit for changing his mind and putting it out there. I'm sure that wasn't easy and a lot of people were ripping him for it. My criticisms are more like, if you were experiencing this, why not just wait? Why not gather more information before you do something like this? Or just, I don't know, look at the human randomized control trials. I will say for Paul, I don't think that it is a malicious thing. I do think he really believes most of the stuff he says. I just think that he is heavily biased towards his own personal experience, and I think he's heavily biased towards what is popular and making him money. And I understand. But whenever I bring up human randomized control trials, or the consensus of the data, he either cherry picks a study in animals or like some random constipation study with no control group, or just goes into, well, science can't tell us everything. Okay, maybe it can't tell us everything, but when the studies are very clearly saying something, please explain how personal experience overrides that. Credit to him for changing his mind. Still not really impressed with what he said, because again, asymmetrical application of logic. All right, guys, hope you liked the video. I'll catch you next week.